departing from the prevailing logic, especially in the lead up to the election, that we need to vote blue no matter who, that the principal objective was to vote for whoever has the D next to their name. If you were to suggest that something other than that might happen, you got a lot of pushback, right? And so, for example, in the lead up to the election, understanding how important it was to get Trump out of office and knowing how early the primary ended because of COVID, I put out there, I wrote an article making the case that the George Floyd protests were at their zenith. These were votes that Joe Biden really needed to win. He needed to be able to galvanize enough people. It wasn't, it was very unclear whether Donald Trump was going to win or lose. We're all in hindsight, it seems like, oh, it's a done deal. But, this was it was a tight election at the end of the day, much tighter than it arguably needed to be. And so my case was that we should be pushing and protesting for Joe Biden to adopt a number of extremely popular policies that are popular even among a lot of Republicans. Policies like, yes, talking about a $15 minimum wage, $2,000 checks, marijuana legalization, Medicare for all, 50% of Republican support, a lot of these kinds of programs, and that it would both benefit everyone because we live in a crisis and it's COVID, and also would make him more electorally viable. But even talking about making Biden a better candidate, withholding one's vote in order to make Biden a better candidate, was described by a lot of the mainstream press as being pro-Trump or being like too willing to throw the election. And it feels like there's a trade-off there, because if ultimately the goal is always just vote for the Democrat, there aren't a lot of opportunities to ask the Democratic Party to do more than the bare minimum, to do more than be just a little bit better than the Republican. And I'm curious, as you have been, commentating and, participating in some of the protests over the summer, what you think of that dynamic and whether you think that there should be more of a willingness to be a little bit more adversarial in that way than we've seen.
Well, clearly now, yeah, there's no question that we have to be adversarial. I think the legitimate fear, quite frankly, was had Mr. Trump been reelected, we would have no more democracy. We would be moving more and more toward a fascist state or country. And I don't think anyone actually knew what could happen. Now, interestingly enough, the candidates that won, the new candidates, were those who were extremely progressive.
Yes.
In St. Louis and in New York and maybe one or two others who came to the table.
Yes.
And yet, even some of the older Democrats have sort of said, well, we lost because we were talking about moving away from the middle. And, I think some of the older folks were afraid of moving away from the middle. Some of the older elected officials, some of the older political heads. I remember hearing James Carver. And I remember him saying something about, well, we got to be in this middle of the road scenario.
Right.
And I think that no one really knew what would work, but the goal was to not reelect Trump. Now, that was the most important goal, but the secondary goal was to be able to give a Democrat, if he or she, in this case it ended up being he, was going to win, at least a decent margin to be able to govern. I mean, we did that just because of the vice president being able to break the tie votes, but it should have been, as I stated earlier, there are several Senate seats that maybe should have been won. Even the Democratic Party in the House lost seats. So some evaluation needs to be done, a real evaluation as to why that happened. Well, were you not talking to the people, or were you not getting the message through to the people? Because the numbers should have been building, not minimized. But I do think that today, in this climate, it is in order to pull, to be adversarial. We need to push this president as much as we can, whether he agrees or not. It's going to always be a civil conversation. And he's a strong person. He's going to say, well, no, just like he said the other night.
Right.
Hopefully that mentality will change,
Mm.
or at least enough pressure can be exerted that it will change. I remember when Ronald Reagan said, I will not sign a King holiday bill. But I remember in 1983 when he said, I'll be honored to sign the King holiday bill. Again, that's because, the political situation changed. So when the people stand up and the people's voices are heard, the politicians have to change their tenor. And so I just think we have to keep advocating, keep exerting. It's called holding politicians accountable, which we've not done enough of. And so I think we have to keep going. I think a number of us, not just any one person, but all of us have to keep going in, and talking to the White House. And, quite frankly, I also believe that should have happened with President Trump. I didn't think he would go far, but if you're not engaged in dialogue, you're not even in the game, and you're not even on the screen. So although I vehemently disagreed with probably 98% of the things that President Trump did, I still believed that someone needed to be at the table raising issues as it relates to the African-American community and communities of color.
I'm glad you raised that, because I think one of the most, and I'm going to move off the subject in a second, but one of the most interesting moments that highlighted how advocacy, particularly for Black issues, will look under a Biden presidency was this leaked call that came out last fall. I don't know, did you catch anything about that, where it was, Al Sharpton and head of NAACP and a lot of civil rights leaders, Sherlyn Ifill, who were having a really substantive conversation with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris about the needs of the Black community. And Sherlyn Ifill in particular made a really compelling case for why he should use his executive authority. Again, one of these things he can do all on his own to advance some of these asks that were coming out of the protest movement over the summer. And the response was less than positive, right? There was kind of a pivot from that ask to, we can't talk about police violence or I'll lose the election. We have the clip. I don't know if it's useful to play the clip, or
more the issue of defund the police.
Defund the police, yeah,
is a complex issue. Not the concept, but the name in itself has a connotation in all communities. In progressive communities, it means we need to do that. But in some communities, it's like, well, the reality is everybody, when they feel they need the police, they call the police. And how the police respond is the problem, is one of the problems. But the reality is that police departments are not supposed to be mental health agencies. So when it comes to that, funding should be somewhere else to address that. Or there are several other areas where police do not have expertise. And so they end up being called on for everything. So I think the concept of defunding the police is one that we've got to figure out, how do we navigate through that? Because it has connotations that cause people to pause some.
So I think the concern was that what Sherlyn Ifill was asking for wasn't, for Joe Biden to rename his campaign the Defund the Police White House 2020 campaign. She asked for an executive order to reverse the ban on race equity discussions. Trump had done the anti-1619 Project thing where he's like, you can't talk about that in schools. She called for a national database on police misconduct. She called to apply Title IX to the police so that federal funds won't go toward discriminatory law enforcement. She asked for him to appoint an attorney general who had the confidence of the Civil Rights Department, who was knowledgeable enough to start day one rooting out all of the awfulness that Donald Trump's been up to for the last 4 years. And in response to those really concrete, legitimate, kind of uncontroversial asks, what it felt like when he pivoted away from it to this other, arguably more controversial issue, was there was an unwillingness to kind of hear and grapple with these issues, and instead a kind of default defensiveness, right? And then when that video came out, and there were so many moments like that, so many contentious moments, right? Like where he someone who it was, I think Cedric Johnson of NAACP said, I just want to caution you as you start to list your appointments, you might lose Georgia if you appoint Vilsack, right? Because he has some tensions relating to his tenure under Obama. And Marcia Fudge, who ultimately got appointed to HUD, would have been a better pick in the eyes of a lot of Georgians, black and white, because of her strong advocacy for farmers and rural communities.
Yeah.
And his response to that was, I know more about these issues than you do. And the real thing that's going to trip us up is defund the police. So there are all of these tense moments that even when the tape came out, there wasn't any criticism from anybody on the call or any of the kind of the black press or the press beyond that. So how can we have accountability when even in these moments, there doesn't seem to be a real willingness to say, hey, we'll support you as a president, but you can't undermine us at every turn. We need to hold you accountable.
Well, let me ask this question.
Sure.
I know that he has done some things through executive order around policing. And also there's the George Floyd Act that was passed in the House. There's the John Lewis Voter Registration Restoration Act that was passed in the House. The hope is that it comes to the Senate now, and it will. The hope is, I hope it's going to pass. Both of those. But the fact of the matter is, I think that there's some of the things even that Cheryl Eiffel talked about are manifesting in an executive order. But I think you need legislation for it to be sustained, because just as he's come in and put us back in the climate accord, which I think is good, by executive order, Trump took us out in that same way. So the next president could do that. So the hope is that there are laws that are put into place, because those are much more difficult to overturn. But I also think that, we got to keep pressuring. And those who have tremendous ability to do that are, certainly, Congressman Clyburn. Because had he not been able to deliver South Carolina, we wouldn't be having any of these conversations about Joe Biden. And I think Joe Biden knows that. But, it's not just one individual. It's a whole lot of people. He did say when he was elected, the first time it was acknowledged that he and Kamala Harris were winners, that he owed the African-American community. So we have to hold him accountable to that.